This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Good evening. Welcome to Teachers Talk Radio, and tonight's Late Late Show is hosted by me, Emily Edwards. This week we're going to explore historical fiction and what its place in history classrooms can look like.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, good evening. Welcome to Teachers Talk Radio tonight. And as I said, my name is Emily Edwards. For any recurring listeners, welcome back. It's good to chat with you again. And if this is your first time with me, here's a bit of background about my role in education so far. So I'm currently teaching secondary history as a full-time classroom teacher. I started my NQT year back when it was called an NQT in 2017, and I have an NPQML as well as experiences in middle leadership, both in temporary positions as a pastoral deputy head of sixth form and curriculum lead in history, although thankfully not at the same time. I also have experience in teaching Key Stage 3 to 5 for history and Key Stage 5 A-level politics. So, with all the introductions having been made, first things first, welcome. It is great to be back talking with you all tonight about the world of education. And with the mini hiatus last week due to open evenings and all that, I've had a bit more time than usual to think about tonight's topic. So, tonight I'd like to discuss the idea of historical fiction. Why are teachers wary of adding fiction to history lessons? What makes historical fiction work? And which texts should we be still wary of in the history classroom?
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishing professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use the code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading.
In today's educational environment, students and teachers are juggling a mix of face-to-face, online and blended learning courses. Canvas by Instructure helps teachers navigate these diverse learning experiences with a user-friendly virtual learning environment that offers flexible access to courses and a consistent learning experience, all while streamlining everyday teaching processes. The world's best schools and universities are using Canvas to create dynamic courses, collaborate seamlessly, and access actionable data that drives student success.
On the 24th to the 26th of January 2024, Bet UK is back, and even better for educators. New for 2024, Table Talks empowers educators to collaborate openly and connect deeply with like-minded individuals in the education space, as well as tech user labs, the brilliant new tutorials and working groups at BET, where technology users will learn how to get more out of their institution's tech from the top education technology experts in the world. Whatever your goal, you'll find it at BET 2024. Educators go free. Get your tickets today at www.uk.betshow.com/visitor-registration.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
The BBC News website reports on announcements that GCSE students in England will get formulae and equations in their maths and science exams for summer 2024. The Department for Education has asked the exam regulator to extend previous support for another year to limit the impact of COVID. Most students who were due to sit GCSE exams next summer were in Year 7 when the first lockdown began. Teaching unions have welcomed the proposal, which is being consulted on. The DfE said it would mean enhanced formulae and equation sheets for pupils in maths, physics and combined science. Education Secretary Gillian Keegan said these pupils will be the last to experience 2 years of national closures during secondary school, and that it was right that they get additional support. She went on to say it was disappointing that the decision had been made so late on, as many pupils will take mocks in the coming months or so. The union ASCL welcomed the consultation, but argued that the provision of support materials should be permitted as it would reduce some of the stress of exam preparation and allow pupils to focus on core knowledge and skills. Prior to this announcement, exams in England had been due to return to 2019 arrangements. Exams were cancelled across the UK in 2020 and 2021, and grades were based on teacher assessments. When students returned to exam halls in 2022, they were given extra support. Some measures remained in place for exams in England in 2023, with exams in the same subject spaced more apart, formulae and equation sheets in some subjects, and not being tested on unfamiliar vocabulary in modern foreign languages. But, unlike the rest of the UK, students in England were not given information on topics on which they were being tested. England was also the only nation this summer to bring back in line with 2019, with Wales and Northern Ireland planning a slower return. As a result, the drop in pass grades was steepest in England. In another week of political drama, the latest government reshuffle has seen the return of many familiar faces. For education, it means the return of former Education Secretary Damian Hinds as Schools Minister. He replaces Nick Gibb, who resigned to pursue a job in the diplomatic service. A report in FE Week focuses on Hinds' previous experience leading the DfE between January 2019 and July 2019, during which time the government completed reforms to technical education. Hinds has previously said, after his 2019 departure, that there was still work to do on social mobility. He was replaced by Gavin Williamson. The Education Secretary stated Mr Hinds is hugely experienced and who would continue to build on Nick Gibb's record of driving up standards. Mr Hinds is the 6th person to hold the Schools Minister role in 18 months. The Glasgow Times reports on what it calls the long-term decline in education standards after the Institute of Fiscal Studies looked at Scotland's disappointing history in PISA figures, an international measure. Since 2012, Scottish scores in maths and science have declined. The figures also show a wide gap between the richest and poorest in maths, science and reading, but more well-off students also underperform when compared to their English counterparts. Large increases in spending and big reforms such as the Curriculum for Excellence do not seem to have translated into higher performance, according to Andrew McKendrick, one of the report's authors. A Scottish Conservative education spokesman said the report should act as a wake-up call for the SNP, and Scottish Labour said it exposed the damage the SNP has done. Finally, Schools Week reports on the invitation to schools to request a free portrait of King Charles II under a new government scheme. The scheme is costing £8 million. Those wishing to take up the offer must apply before the 2nd of February 2024. The King will be shown in ceremonial dress and delivery of the images will take place between February and April next year. The A3 size picture will be printed on high-quality paper and be in a glazed frame. Schools which display pictures of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth will not be obliged to take down her portrait. Suggested placement of the image of His Majesty is reception areas or a function room or similar location. Schools will not be able to see the portrait before submitting requests. The image is not being funded from school budgets but out of a separate pot similar to the scheme which provided a free book to every primary school pupil to mark the Queen's Platinum Jubilee in 2021. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Jo Fox.
Right then, so let's jump into it tonight and talk about the basics. What is historical fiction and why have history teachers been a bit wary of it? So, historical fiction is a genre that combines traditional storytelling with historical events, settings, figures, or contexts. So, in historical fiction, authors weave fictional narratives, characters, and dialogue into the backdrop of real historical periods, which offers readers a different perspective on those actual historical events. So, some really famous examples include The Boy in the Striped Pajamas by John Boyne, the Assassin's Creed franchise, which is mostly a game series, but they did add some books to accompany the series, and War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Overall, while the characters and storylines can be fictional, they often interact with or are influenced by real historical figures and events, providing a blend of entertainment and education. So, like with every other genre in the literary world, there isn't really anything wrong with using fiction in lessons to engage students. You can use it to study writing techniques and you can use it to explore different worlds or different perspectives. In fact, I think many history teachers have explored other genres in their lessons. So, for example, I know I've used poetry from soldiers like Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen to explore World War One and its impact on those who enlisted. So, why have history teachers generally been wary of using historical fiction as a genre in particular? Well, if you're asking me, and I hope you are, I think history teachers, and I do include my past self in this, have been wary of using historical fiction for several reasons. So, some of the most common reasons for this wariness include kind of historical accuracy being kind of the biggest one on my mind, as we see that historical fiction often takes very creative liberties with historical events and, I say characters, but historical figures. Um, and I think ultimately a lot of history teachers have seen or read some media that swears that it's based on true events, only for us to be left profoundly miffed, I think, to put it politely, at how fast and loose those writers have been with the actual facts. And I think if we include those sorts of narratives, there is the fear that students will internalize the fictional elements as historical fact, and that will just compound and lead to misconceptions about the past. And I think this is especially true with texts that have been written specifically to persuade the reader into believing a specific point of view or to build up a historical figure with a certain personality and a certain story arc. Um, and I think that's a problem when we see that the facts actually argue otherwise. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. There's also a concern with using historical fiction in terms of the lack of primary sources, because I think in history education in particular, the use of primary sources such as documents, letters, and artifacts is really highly valued. This is where we test and develop our analytical skills, as well as build our fundamental understanding of the past. These are our puzzle pieces that we can put together after all. So, my concern, I think, as a past teacher who has been very concerned about introducing historical fiction without care, is that many examples of historical fiction do seem to lean more heavily into the fiction rather than the history part. And so, as a result, it may not provide students with what's true and what's fictional in terms of the source material provided. And it doesn't really give students the skills needed to critically analyze and interpret these real historic sources. It's also can be a bit of a problem when it comes to assessment, not as a kind of formal approach, but more so, do they actually understand what they've been taught? So, if students are struggling to grasp some of the historical context and struggle to differentiate between the fictional elements and the actual history, that could eat into our lesson time, which I think, as we all know in education, I feel there's never enough time to get across everything we want to talk about and everything that we think is important for students to learn about. And so, with historical fiction, it may take more time to unpick misconceptions rather than using more traditional sources of information. Furthermore, authors of historical fiction often inject their own interpretations and many times their own biases into the narrative. And this can lead to concerns about presenting a skewed version of history, especially if the author does have a particular agenda or a particular focus they want to emphasize. And with, as I say, the limited time we have to teach, I think for history teachers, accessing high quality primary sources and historical interpretations from historians who are looking to educate rather than to entertain can sometimes raise the question of, is it worth bringing in fictional material at the expense of existing non-fiction material? And in terms of historical fiction generally, if you're introducing different books, they will usually focus on a specific event, time period, or a character. And I think that comes with it some issues in deciding what to include or how much of that historical fiction to include. And so sometimes it's not even about the quality of the work, but actually trying to find the time for a proper analysis and to use that source of historical fiction really effectively. And we want to avoid, obviously, as history teachers, providing a really narrow view of history because there are so many different pieces that, when fit together, create a much more interesting tapestry of events and a story that really is fundamental to our understanding of the past and how we get to where we are today. And so, by focusing on individual characters or eras, it might limit our scope. I know that I've read a lot of different historical fiction books on ancient Greece, and whilst I've absolutely loved understanding these different characters and the different nuances and the real people associated with these narratives, if obviously I'm trying to use those sorts of texts to try and teach things like the Trojan Wars, it's not necessarily going to provide the overarching picture that a lot of students need to then be able to go back and hang those smaller, more personal stories into the wider scope of events. And kind of penultimately, I think there's a big concern within teaching that historical fiction may encourage this passive consumption of stories without actually promoting any critical thinking. When we look at sources, usually there are questions that involve breaking down the source, critically analyzing where the source is coming from. NOP is our go to acronym for sources: nature, origin, purpose. What is it? Where does it come from? Why has it been made? And having those aspects, having those skills and analysis really does help students to think critically about where the information is coming from and to make their own decisions about the information presented. And sometimes, if you present students with a very clean cut story, it might encourage them to just accept the past without question. And for history students, that's a bit of a recipe for disaster. And finally, looking at a loss of objectivity. Historical fiction can really evoke strong emotions, and that can lead to students developing personal feelings or opinions about real historical people or real events via the angle that the author has taken, via the author's presentation of that material. So I think a really easy one is if you see a character based on a historical figure in a TV show or in a book where they're presented really charismatically, if they're presented, especially in film or TV, with a very appealing actor, whether that's personality or looks, up to you, that can obviously lead to the kind of audience creating a very defined sense of who they believe that person was, rather than having a genuine understanding of that person and linking it to the actual history. I think the Tudors TV series probably is a very good example of this. Regardless of how you feel about the series, those characters, those real people, are presented in a way that fits a narrative, creating this kind of loss of objectivity, which can be a bit of a problem. However, despite these concerns, which I do believe are perfectly valid and do need to be considered before introducing historical fiction into the history classroom, I do believe that historical fiction can be an incredibly valuable addition to our lessons when used carefully and in conjunction with other types of sources. When teachers provide that appropriate guidance and context, I really do think students can benefit from that engagement and the empathy that historical fiction can provide, whilst developing the critical thinking skills to evaluate the accuracy of these different narratives.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishing professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use the code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading.
In today's educational environment, students and teachers are juggling a mix of face-to-face, online and blended learning courses. Canvas by Instructure helps teachers navigate these diverse learning experiences with a user-friendly virtual learning environment that offers flexible access to courses and a consistent learning experience, all while streamlining everyday teaching processes. The world's best schools and universities are using Canvas to create dynamic courses, collaborate seamlessly, and access actionable data that drives student success.
On the 24th to the 26th of January 2024, Bet UK is back, and even better for educators. New for 2024, Table Talks empowers educators to collaborate openly and connect deeply with like-minded individuals in the education space, as well as tech user labs, the brilliant new tutorials and working groups at Bet, where technology users will learn how to get more out of their institution's tech from the top education technology experts in the world. Whatever your goal, you'll find it at Bet 2024. Educators go free. Get your tickets today at www.uk.betshow.com/visitor-registration.
So, this is now the crux, the hinge point of the show. Why should history teachers use historical fiction in their lessons? Well, I think there are some really clear positives for historical fiction, and there are some easy solutions that can be used to address some of the negatives. So, for example, historical fiction can really captivate students' interests. And I think this is such an important part of any teacher's repertoire. It should be a really important focus when we're introducing, especially new topics. How can we hook those students in? How can we get them to really buy into why we're studying this period of time, this person, this era? Why should they care? And I think historical fiction offers a narrative that can really bring history to life. It can make the past seem more relatable and more engaging by turning those facts, those names, those places, those dates into real people with real stories. Seeing it from maybe a first person perspective can really flesh out those stories and build history from this very rote learning, traditional approach to this more complex idea, this nuanced approach of interweaving stories. And I think that can create an opportunity to foster a real love of history through the people, through those stories, and then building on that with the wider understanding. On top of that, I think reading historical fiction really allows students to empathize with people of the past. And this is something that I've found throughout my career has been incredibly important. I think, especially in subjects where we can be very detached from the history, it happened ages ago, the idea of the olden times, which I think is a phrase that always sends a shiver up my spine. This idea of it's happened ages ago, it doesn't apply to us now, can be a real obstacle for a lot of history lessons to overcome. And so I think creating an opportunity for students to gain a deeper understanding of the experiences, the emotions, and the perspectives of real human beings, of real figures, even if it is within a more fictionalized setting, can be used to really develop that historical empathy. I will be discussing some excellent examples of this later on in the show of how writers have been able to do this without sacrificing the accuracy of the past, which I think is a very difficult tightrope to walk. So I am looking forward to talking about that in a little bit. Also, I think as history teachers, we can use nearly any resource to develop understanding or skills. It doesn't necessarily have to be those traditional primary and secondary sources. And I think we can even use some historical fiction in a critical manner. After all, I think every history teacher in the country has died a bit inside every time they've read a student answer that tried to argue that the source is not useful because it is biased. I think that phrase is absolutely terrible. And it is kind of the go to for students of dismissing parts of a narrative in history because it is one sided. And I think by exploring historical fiction, we can learn how to separate the fact from the fiction and get students to address those misconceptions and understand how these sources can still be useful, even if they are potentially very one sided or quite limiting. And I think that's a great way to introduce that opportunity to expand their skills within the safe environment of a classroom. And in today's modern world, navigating things like social media and looking at conflicting narrative online is obviously a very key issue for young people. And so developing those skills is going to be even more important as students kind of grow and adapt and change the world around them. So ultimately, I think looking at historical fiction in a positive way is that we can use this to interweave the skills that we see in other subjects. Having an interdisciplinary approach, I think, in schools is a great way to foster education as a wider net, in essence, rather than just subjects that are islands unto themselves. History, in particular, I think, is a great subject to connect with not just other humanities subjects, but also just generally within the school. I think the easiest ones, I think, that come to mind would be things like English literature, English language, politics, modern foreign languages, and kind of other humanities based subjects. But generally, promoting this holistic and interdisciplinary approach of historical context only serves our students and gives us as teachers a chance to really explore history from different perspectives and to introduce, obviously, some new and various techniques for us to try out and for us to kind of get excited about the history that we've taught potentially, 5, 10, 15 years in a row. It gives us a fresh perspective as well. And I think it's a great way for us to supplement kind of traditional history textbooks and those traditional resources and provide those alternative viewpoints in a way that's only going to enrich students' understanding rather than create more limitations. So, whilst we've looked at all the positives, I do have to address obviously some of the elephants in the room, some of the negatives that may crop up. Obviously, if you have your own concerns with historical fiction, please do feel free to leave them in the chat. More than happy to discuss different ideas and different perceptions around this topic as we go. So, firstly, I think we all know that badly written historical fiction is an absolute pain for teachers. It often contains inaccuracies, leading to misconceptions and frustrations on our part as we're trying to figure out the fact from the fiction. And I think an easy way to address this is A, avoiding books that prioritize drama and storytelling over historical accuracy, but also as well to pair historical fiction with the factual sources and actually encourage students to compare and contrast. Where do you notice where this piece of historical fiction has gone above and beyond and has linked it to actual history? Where do we see the book kind of play fast and loose with some of the facts? Where can we see some inaccuracies? And I think students can then gain a greater understanding of construction of the past and how different people can manufacture different narratives to create a specific viewpoint and promote certain ideas. It also gives students a great way to actually address more traditional sources by breaking down provenances, breaking down background, rather than just using traditional sources that can be somewhat repetitive after a certain period of time. And in doing so, I think students can really develop more nuance and really understand the ideas of usefulness and reliability in a wider context rather than basic exam skills, basic exam prep. So, Another issue that I've noticed is that authors of historical fiction can also present a very limited perspective, or even in some cases omits hugely significant events or perspectives that lead to this very skewed understanding of history. And that is a problem if it is accepted point blank by students. And I think an easy way to challenge this is if students are guided or if teachers suggest ways to read multiple different versions of this event, either through different forms of historical fiction or even just from different perspectives within the same novel, if it gives you that opportunity. Obviously, this can be a bit of a problem if students react very strongly to different quote unquote characters, if they're based on historical people. So if they see that this character has, treated another character very poorly, and they have a negative view of that initial character, that can obviously be very difficult for teachers then to go, well, have you thought about it from their perspective? Since understandably, nobody wants to be supportive of somebody who they perceive to be a bad influence or a bad character or figure. And I'm not going to argue that this is an easy job. If it was, our lives as teachers would be significantly easier. But I think we need to give young people more credits and acknowledge that they are, in fact, quite switched on than sometimes we give them credit for. And I think both primary and secondary age school children can learn to separate the character from the historical figure. And I've even had some examples in the classroom of discussing different presentations of historical figures, both using historical fiction and using accounts of the time, and discussing how, even in reality, these narratives about these figures can be established in sometimes very critical ways, sometimes very positive ways, all depending on perception. And that can be something where students themselves then create their own perceptions and acknowledge, obviously, where they have limitations through their own biases, but also as well being able to examine different perspectives from other students in the room. And I think what works very well is kind of evaluating that emotional reaction. So, a great example that I've used in the past that's had some surprisingly at the time positive results, was exploring Richard III as a villain and Henry Tudor as this hero based on Shakespeare's works. And whilst the narrative itself is historical fiction in the sense of very exaggerated characters, some events are played a little bit fast and loose with the Wars of the Roses, but ultimately, what I've seen is that students have an increased attachment to these quote unquote characters, and it helps them to understand the impact of Shakespeare's work. So, understanding the impact of um, Henry VII, understanding Richard III, and the text that Shakespeare writes within the Tudor era, and understanding the importance and the power of propaganda at the time, based on their own emotional reactions, has led to this real nuanced approach from students in understanding that impact. And so there's a lot of ways that we can incorporate historical fiction into history lessons without compromising on time, without compromising on accuracy, and without dumbing down history in a sense. It can even be a really valuable teaching tool when used thoughtfully. And usually, obviously, as history teachers, we never just rely on one piece of information. We like to use lots of different sources in conjunction with other sources, critical thinking exercises, historians' interpretations, etc., etc. Um, Ultimately, I do believe historical fiction can really bring history to life as a subject and foster empathy and critical analysis. And whilst I understand that we can be quite wary, we never want to do a disservice to our students by not providing them with accurate information or with the potential for them to create their own misunderstandings. But I really think that teachers, obviously, as professionals, have the autonomy and have obviously the skills to be able to address these potential problems inherent in the genre and create a really effective use that works within their classrooms for historical fiction. So, probably the most controversial part of the entire show, our kind of big section here, looking at what would I recommend, what would I avoid. Now, understandably, these will be mostly my opinions. I have asked other history teachers within my school what they thought, and they had some similar agreements and a couple of interesting additions. If you yourself have any types of historical fiction, any particular books or TV shows or games even that you want to include and throw into the mix, please do feel free to pop that in the chat. And I would love to hear your suggestions of how you've been incorporating this into your own lessons as well. So, hopefully, I've convinced you to give historical fiction a go. So, where do we start? The interesting part is that obviously we have hundreds, probably thousands of different books to go to. So instead of trying to list lots of my favorites and some of my not so favorites, I thought what I do, like any good historian, is to create a set of criteria. So, what is Miss Edwards's go-to criteria for historical fiction to make sure that they can be used effectively and ethically in history classrooms? So, criteria point number one, is it accurate? Now, I'll be honest, when I pitched the idea for tonight's show with the rest of the Teachers Talk Radio team, I did promise that it wouldn't just be a rant about the boy in the striped pajamas, but I am only human, so I'll make this section very quick. When teaching about the Holocaust, I think we as history teachers have such an important job in presenting those facts as openly and accurately as possible, because obviously we and our students need to challenge the anti-Semitic nonsense that we find out there on social media surrounding things, including the Holocaust, for example, denial or people trying to dismiss survivor testimonies, things like that. And one of my big issues is that the boy in the striped pajamas promotes the narrative around the son of an SS officer, Bruno. And Bruno, for some reason in the book, is 9 years old, but is completely unaware of World War II, his father's role in the concentration camps, and even why Shmuel, the young Jewish boy, is in said concentration camp. It's a deeply, I think, problematic place to start, purely because we know from history that German children were taught in schools where teachers were part of the Nazi Party. They taught anti-Semitic Nazi propaganda, and they forced students to swear oaths of loyalty to Hitler and to fight and die for the Fuhrer. So without that core knowledge, students reading the book may not realize how indoctrinated German children were and how common anti-Semitism was in Germany at that point, and even to some extent how supported the Nazis were in Germany, especially with the nature of these characters. And I think that's is a huge issue within teaching things like the Holocaust, where it's such a difficult and mature topic to discuss. We have to try and make sure that those key facts are included and not use books like The Boy in the Striped Pajamas as our go-to source for information on the Holocaust because of that different perspective and because it misses out those core accurate elements that do have some significant weighting in the narrative of the Holocaust. Thanks, Paul, for your comments. So absolutely, in terms of primary education, I think there's a really great opportunity to discuss history from kind of a historical empathy perspective. So it is absolutely great to get young children in particular discussing ideas around what do they think about people like Queen Elizabeth in the Tudors, for example, and a great way to then build in some of the history skills they'll encounter with secondary, whilst also at the same time giving students opportunity to challenge their own ideas or the ideas from historical fiction, is to compare it with contemporary sources from the time. So looking at how Elizabeth presents herself, looking at how other key figures talk about Elizabeth, and again, have students go, well, based on this picture, what do you think about her? Based on this portrayal in a film or a TV show, what do you think she's like? And I think it's a great way for students to have a bit more ownership over the history, rather than it being something that has happened, it's something they're involved with. So I think in terms of primary education, I know that history is taught
really well in terms of these kind of small pockets, because obviously of the nature of the curriculum. So I think it's just making the most of getting students' opinions. So potentially making it more interdisciplinary. So teaching English skills and writing skills along with historical perceptions, using historical fictions to then write their own potential narrative events using key events from history. That could be a really fun way for students to see how history is constructed, whilst obviously making time for the literacy and writing skills they'll need, obviously, throughout their entire education. But hopefully that's a couple of ideas for you, Paul. Great question to ask. Thank you for chiming in. Please feel free to keep adding to the discussion. No worries, thank you. Now, I think in terms of my kind of Holocaust example, this one might be a bit more unknown as a really good example of how to induce historical fiction would be Magneto Testament. It's a comic book by Greg Pak, and it talks about the Holocaust through the X-Men characters, and particularly it focuses on the titular character of Magneto. Now, for the record, I know I'm probably quite alone in being a massive DC Marvel superhero fan on Teachers Talk Radio, but the character itself of Magneto is canonically within the series a Holocaust survivor since the 1980s run by Chris Claremont. And so it's really quite interesting that within this modern interpretation of Magneto as a character, they really lean into discussing the Holocaust rather than it being a light touch approach. And the fascinating thing about Magneto Testament is that it specifically spoke with Holocaust survivors, and to make sure that the narrative events they presented within the fictional world of the X-Men was actually reflecting real historical events and the impact of the Nazi regime on Jewish Germans in the 1930s and into the 1940s as factually as possible. And I think that's so brilliant that they're able to introduce the history accurately without feeling that they were sacrificing a dramatic narrative. It's a really interesting way for students to explore different events and to connect the nature of events, while seemingly in their mind they're just reading a comic book character in essence. So it's a nice easy way to sneak in a bit of extra history and to see the long-term impact of things like the Nazis, the development and the cruelty of the Holocaust within a fictional narrative, without missing out the key facts that I believe The Boy in the Striped Pajamas does. So that's my rant. I'm going to close it off there before I get too carried away. So my second point of criteria: does it provide students with an engaging perspective? Because there is no point introducing text or fiction or mixture of both if we are not getting students to explore different perspective, if it's not bringing something different to the metaphorical table. So I know that I've been reading through lots of historical fiction about Greek mythology and Greek history, and so thankfully, my bank balance has allowed me to be able to see the Trojan War from a variety of different perspectives, from Helen's perspective, from Patroclus's perspective, from Achilles' perspective, as well as looking at ancient Greek mythology at a female perspective from Circe and Ariadne. And I think the interesting part of this is looking at traditionally male texts, or traditionally straight male text to be specific, from minority perspectives, so from women, from the LGBTQ plus community. And I think that's really encouraged me to diversify the curriculum and understand the role that different voices can have. And I think that can be a fantastic way to use historical fiction to discuss different events from traditionally quieter voices within the medium, and avoid relying on those traditional and sometimes even outdated interpretations. So, criteria number 3, does it provide historical empathy? And I think this is where it can really come alive for students when they care about the history, when they care about the people and the understanding of what history does to ordinary people. I know there are some excellent books that are staples in the English teacher's classroom that can also be applied to history as well. The Book Thief by Markus Zusak is a great tale narrated by Death and follows a young girl's experience during the Holocaust, creating obviously this unique narrative perspective while still emphasizing a really sympathetic and empathetic response to the characters involved during this time. Also, The Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates combines these incredibly magical elements with a realistic approach to slavery and to the freedom that the character tries to find, obviously within the narrative of the transatlantic slave trade and the Underground Railroad in America. And I think this can be a really fantastic way to connect human experiences with a way to really engage with different perspectives. Absolutely, yes, Paul, spot on. We've been doing this for really a long time, and we've tried, I think, to introduce different narratives from very traditional history perspectives. And it's just trying to see if we can find anything fresh, anything new that can really capture students' imaginations and lead them to really wanting to know as much about the past as possible. And I think it's really interesting in terms of, like you say, Paul, building in a bit of a more modern approach to looking at history and revamping the curriculum from our own perspectives within a lesson focus to really connect the dots for students and help them to see the wider picture that history can present. Thank you for your comments, by the way. My fourth criteria point, can it provide a way to help students understand the content using allegory? Now, this one I really liked, and it really adds to my nerdy credentials, I suppose, is that when I was teaching Year 8 about 3 or 4 weeks ago, we were talking about the Nazi regime, and I was trying to explain how imposing these rallies, for example, like the Nuremberg rally, was for people who attended, because students were kind of struggling to understand, why didn't anybody just speak up? Why did people complain about it? Why did people go? And so I pulled up a picture of the First Order from Star Wars, and it had a rally, and it was obviously based on Nazi and fascist rallies generally, in terms of the design, the logos, the structure of it all, the single leader promoting the party via speeches, things like that. And as soon as I showed them the picture and compared it with the Nuremberg rally, suddenly I saw a couple of light bulb moments when they pointed out the comparisons, and they understood, oh, that is an element of fascism because it sees there to there. And I think that's such a fantastic way where historical fiction can be used to discuss real history through the idea of allegory. So instead of trying to just list out the features of 20th century fascism, they were able to point out those features for themselves based on either their knowledge of Star Wars, and I saw who the geeky kids were in the room and who I could have a good conversation with about Star Wars at lunchtime, as well as the students who were able to just point out from the pictures themselves. So ultimately, a great way to use historical fiction as a way to teach content through allegory. And finally, my last step, can it be used as a way to analyze sources or interpretations? Now, this one I think is one of my most unusual connections, but it has been something that I've seen work, and it's one of my favorite uses of historical fiction, if I'm being honest, and it's why I've left it till last. And I think historical fiction is a great way to explore bias, to explore reliability, usefulness, and the impacts of an individual perspective in a very unusual and therefore more engaging way. So one of the most famous Batman storylines is A Death in the Family, which was a 1988 run. Famously or infamously, depending on how you like the character, it killed off Jason Todd, sorry for spoilers, who was the Robin at the time. Now, whilst that is a very interesting plot point, it is surprisingly not what I teach students when I introduce this in my modern history lessons. In fact, it's actually the somewhat side plot to it all, where Batman and Superman have to stop the Joker from killing the UN General Assembly. And the reason I use this is because it portrays the relationship between America and Iran in the 1980s fantastically. The bad guy, the villain, quote unquote, is the Ayatollah Khomeini. And the Joker works with this real life historical figure and frames the threat of Iran as being as big to America as the Joker is to Batman. And it's such a great way to see these students absolutely shocked, realizing they're seeing historical figures used in a fictional way. And the way they're used creates obviously a very clear sense of perspective at the time, alliances, in this case, obviously enemies or rivalries, and the idea of how different nations viewed each other at this time through how they tell their stories. Who is the bad guy? Who is the good guy? All through these fictional stories, and creating these people as characters rather than as actual people, which absolutely fun. I highly recommend. Comics are a fantastic source for this. Superman and Captain America, for example, fighting the Nazis, having backgrounds with Jewish American authors. Brilliant to show the link between obviously American involvement or the lack thereof and this increase in superhero narratives where Hitler is the bad guy. But also as well, Superman has a great storyline in a radio show where he fights, quote unquote fights, the KKK. And having the writer for the show go undercover as part of the KKK to gain information about the terrorist organization was such a fantastic addition to the story, where actual history was being included, seemingly unintentionally from a history perspective, but obviously very intentional to frame the KKK in a very negative way, as it should be. And it's very interesting that that piece of historical fiction can be used to explore different attitudes, looking at different groups, different historical events or figures, and to explore them in a more unique, more engaging way. So by keeping these steps in mind and this criteria in mind, and obviously feel free to tweak and change and adapt based on what works best for your classroom. You know your students and you know your classroom best. But ultimately, I wanted to give some examples so that you can see how historical fiction can really be included in a very easy and effortless way to develop more nuanced opinions, both from us as staff, but also as well from students, and give them the ability to deconstruct different texts and create their own more thorough picture of the past by being able to decipher the reality from the fiction. So, as a bit of a bonus, I haven't obviously managed to be quite regular, obviously with open evenings, so I thought I'd add in some extra fun bits and pieces. So I thought I'd add in some of my favourite books that didn't quite fit into the show, but I really did want to include. So, for example, Maus, whilst not a piece of fiction traditionally, because it is based on a Holocaust survivor's testimony, it is an absolutely fantastic read and a great inclusion into the classroom for a piece of literature that is entirely factual, but is framed in a more fantastical setting, with the Nazis framed as cats and Jewish people framed as mice or kind of rats to reflect the language and the attitudes of the time. Persepolis, hopefully I've said that right, is a first comic book and then a movie looking at the Iranian Revolution, which again is a real account, but the way it's framed is in a more fictionalized setting, a fictionalized approach, which absolutely would recommend as well if you're teaching more modern history. And I know recently, in terms of films, biographies, Killers of the Flower Moon, Oppenheimer, Napoleon, whilst obviously some are more historically accurate than others, I'm not going to get into the whole Napoleon debates. I haven't got the time for it, unfortunately. They are very good in terms of engaging students with the past, and again can be a great example of watching the clip, talking about the film, what's accurate, what's inaccurate, and linking then into why maybe these choices have been made and how that can obviously develop their understanding of the past. In terms of games, now this one is a little bit of a brag, I'll be honest with you. It's the Assassin's Creed franchise. And my boyfriend just finished Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and it was really exciting chatting to him about what was historically accurate in the game, what he noticed in terms of the storyline. And this is a little bit of a brag, but I was really chuffed to have been able to figure out who the kind of big baddie, in a sense, the father of the order was, based on my knowledge of teaching Anglo-Saxon and Viking history in school. And I think that was a really fun way for me to get engaged, because even though I knew bits and pieces of the history, I was able to get more invested in that and feel pretty chuffed getting the actual outcome before the storyline had wrapped up. And it's a great way, I think, as well, for us to have those discussions and to be able to not only show off our vast amount of historical knowledge that we've spent however many years accumulating, but also it is just a fun way to talk about history, to discuss what we like, and to see if we can apply that history to these fictionalized accounts and develop our own understanding of it a bit more. And finally, I do have to do a bit of a shout out to Horrible Histories. I'd be a terrible history teacher if I didn't. Absolutely love the series, both the books and the TV series, and I think it's a great way to get students engaged with these kind of comedy sketches, the songs. Charles II's King of Bling, incredibly iconic, and every time I teach the Stuarts, it is used, no matter what age group I'm teaching, all the way from year 8 all the way up to 6th form. It's a great way to discuss different actual factual parts of the history, as well as see how is this character presented, what does that tell you about the real historical person. So again, just a bit of a bonus there, some honourable mentions, not fully fictional, but not traditionally non-fiction either. Please obviously feel free to chip in as well in the chat if there are any of your favourites that I've missed. Lots of different examples to talk about there. So to wrap up, overall, there are so many highly rated historical fiction books out there that cover a wide range of historical periods and events, and they offer opportunities for history teachers, both primary and secondary, to engage our students with well-crafted narratives that provide really thorough insights into the past. After all, history is all about stories. Whether we are exploring wartime experiences, societal changes, personal journeys, anything at all, these novels can enhance our history lessons by bringing this context, bringing these stories and these voices to life through compelling storytelling. So hopefully I've been able to give you some tips on how to incorporate historical fiction into your history lessons. And thank you as always for tuning in this week to listen to me on Teachers Talk Radio. Lovely to see you in the future for my other shows coming up, obviously. So please do keep an eye on social medias for more details. And in the meantime, thank you so much for your time tonight and for your engagement. Please take care, and I will see you next time.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.